Is time for another live episode of NIRO Knowledge. So welcome to everybody who's going to be popping on here. I'll have to apologize a little bit if I'm slow with certain things reading. If people pop into the chat, I did have an eye appointment, so the drops and the dilation and all the fun stuff is still things a touch blurry, but it is getting a little bit better. So I was thinking about coming on with some sunglasses and just doing it that way, but I'm sure everybody would have started talking in terms of, oh my God, he must have a hangover. It's 1 p.m. Can you believe it? But we'll go from there anyway. So today, the topic I wanted to talk about was traditional policing. So I've spoken about different things in regards to data and data quality and what we deal with as analysts in that realm, and some of the things that we can do and work with in order to address it. But one of the things I think a lot of us get challenged with as well is traditional policing, and by that there is this practice still in effect in this idea of traditional policing, and that it does somehow make a great impact on the safety of the community and the things that the police are getting done at that moment in time. And obviously, if you are listening to the show, if you were listening to the guests, I bring on a lot of academia, a lot of research, and believe that we can move forward in terms of evidence-based policing and some of the practices that are put forth with the research. Not everything works for everybody, but if the research is there, we try it out and it does or doesn't work, and there might be some issues there. It can go back, in a sense, to the drawing board and get refined. So traditional policing doesn't fully do that, doesn't take into account the analytical aspect. And again, we still deal a lot with the idea that analysts should be bean counters and really just sit there and just spit out the numbers that are there. And as we're well aware, the analytical product actually gives us a better advantage to becoming more effective and efficient in the practices, and devising some form of strategy to address a problematic situation, whether it's a crime that's happening or quality of life. There's two different levels of issues that happen within a community, within a jurisdiction for an agency, that really needs to be addressed. And how do we go about addressing it in the most effective and efficient manner? And as we're all aware, the analysis part can really be effective in getting that done. So traditional policing was something I wanted to start with in this conversation, because it really is, and I'll just pull from this. I'm pulling this from the Pop Center from the ASU. So kudos to them for having all this great material that's out there for us to comb through. But they have it right here: the traditional or professional policing model emphasized crime control through high visibility policing, random police patrols, rapid response to all citizen calls to the police, and follow-up criminal investigations by detectives. So kind of 4 defining features for traditional policing. And what happens within there's some great aspects, but there's also some problems that start shaping the way things get done. So as we're well aware, again, random police patrols, right? The random patrols equal random results. And that's always been one of the structured problems, in a sense, with traditional policing is, you have these officers going out, driving around whichever way they want or feel as though they should, and they come across something, and maybe they did prevent something, but what really is the probability of that happening? It becomes very, very minute, right, at that point. So what can we change, right? As analysts, we can actually go through some of the historical data. Maybe there's also a crime series or now a pattern that's coming through. And we can see the windows of opportunity that are happening in a spatial and temporal level, and actually put people in their place, put officers in the place that they need to be in order to better affect some sort of change, whether it's being a reduction, excuse me, of the crimes that are happening in that area, or being there in order to apprehend and ID and apprehend possible suspects and the offenders that are committing these crimes. At the same level, it leaves out a piece of that function of tracking really what's becoming effective. So driving around, random patrols equal random results is one of the best, in a sense, equations to put forward, because think of how often it's like, hey, you know what? People drop lottery tickets. I'm just going to go randomly walk. How many times are you going to find a lottery ticket on the ground at that point, right? So we can come up with all kinds of different scenarios in terms of randomness and just coming across things at that point in time. So one of the aspects that's really killer, and that's why it's great that we use the temporal and spatial aspect of analysis to kind of really boil down and figure out where we're going to be, where we're going to go to be effective and efficient, and implement a strategy at that point to say, hey, we're going to curb something as opposed to just happening across something, fingers crossed and hopefully, right? One of the better ideas, in a sense, though, with traditional policing was the idea of high visibility policing. And we can always kick back, in a sense, the Kansas City model in terms of both residents, right? People who are in the area not noticing the level of saturation for the patrolling that's happening. But at the same point, high visibility policing is something that you're technically doing, that we're doing with an analytical practice sometimes of hotspots. Some people with DDAX. We can gauge the level of effectiveness of just having a cruiser in the area, right? And sitting on a certain area, and maybe at a certain intersection, certain days and times during the week, to see if we're reducing accidents there, reducing traffic issues and concerns, reducing, and really measure what's happening, as long as we're also measuring when that high visibility patrol might be there, right? So, another way that there's a plus in some of the traditional aspects that we can move forward with some of these newer practices with evidence-based policing, problem-oriented and community-oriented policing, and things that are of evidence-based practices, right? The rapid response to the calls for service, all calls for service to the police. I think I can't even remember the statistic at this point, but I remember reading that pretty much the level of apprehension when officers are quick to respond to these calls, right, are very minimal based on the call type. I think maybe the only one, in a sense, that we as agencies, their officers themselves, get to quickly to actually help with end up being a domestic violence. The people are usually still there on scene. Nobody's kind of left the area at that point. But, people who believe that there's a burglary in progress, that there's a robbery there, whatever calls that there might be that are coming in, our rapid response usually doesn't mean that we're having any success in apprehension of the offender at that point. So really something to look at, to navigate, to figure out, what does that mean? What level of response is necessary? And that's not to say that we shouldn't be responding and being effective in our reactive patrolling to the calls for service. But what are we measuring? Does it really have an effect to have an officer going lights and sirens straight across town for some of these agencies in order to get to a call for service faster without having really the effect that we believe that it's going to be having? So always a piece of concern, because there are obviously accidents that take place when an emergency service vehicle is responding rapidly to an incident that's taking place, an emergency incident. So, that level of service is necessary, obviously, for certain circumstances, but a vast majority of the time, it does not seemingly help us apprehend those who are the offenders at that point or suspects. So, a little bit of give and take. What's your response time, and does it have to be at a certain level? What is expected of the public versus what is, necessary really for officers to respond to effectively and within that, crunch time fashion. So, and along with that, the follow-up investigations by detectives, it's a good start. There's also sometimes just too much work that you put on to certain officers, especially when it starts, making its way through. If you have an officer in every town and instance and agency is a little different. If your detective is called to an investigation immediately, then they can deal with it as their specialty as they need to and drive it from there. Unfortunately, was it about 85% of the agencies across the law enforcement agencies across the U.S. don't tend to have certain luxuries of having a division of labor, let's say, where your officer can respond, hole up for a second, hold the scene, whatever it might be, and have detectives come in and deal with it from there. Your officer tends to be most likely the detective themselves as well. So with that struggle, in a sense, you may have an officer who's doing the investigation for quite some time before they get to maybe a bump in the road, and not whatever you might want to call it in terms of an analogy. But now this detective has to come in and play catch up. So what did they miss? What would they have asked beforehand, right? So your detectives doing the follow-up investigations may not always be the best priority to set, since your officers most likely are the ones that have done a lot of the work, a lot of the legwork to begin with. So quite a little bit of a list. That's traditional policing. Some of what I talked about last year with Dr. Cynthia Lum was her work with several of her peers in terms of putting out the paper for Reinventing American Policing. And, a piece of that is obviously going to have to be reviewing and looking at these old practices and really what do they mean? What value do they hold? Why are we still doing things this way if they're not getting the results that we would hope to have, right? That we can benefit from. So, with that, as analysts, I would always say, ask the why questions, figure out what I always like to call the end game is, right? What are you expecting for results from what you're doing, no matter what piece it is? Whether you're doing a monthly report, CompStat, you're trying to devise which is the best method to, piece your data together or hub it in some form from a central spot from so many different silos. What's your end result? What is the end game? What are you expecting out of that? Why do you need that, if it is essential or not, right? So you can prioritize from there. But really, it ends up being, what are we going to do as agencies, as law enforcement in the future, in order to make these changes that become more effective and efficient, once again, that don't have some of these practices into play that are somewhat moot at this point, right? I mean, driving around aimlessly to find something doesn't hold much value anymore, because it's just a waste of time at that point. With personnel being on short supply, and unfortunately people applying to this job at this point, what can we do as analysts to kind of alleviate those problems for the officers that are already in place, for the detectives that are already in place, for the administrative staff that are already in place, for the higher ups, right, that we all work with, and for the public, for the community themselves? What is it we're going to do as analysts, and why do we need to do it to help drive some more of that change, to make the change, to make things more cohesive and better for both the agency, for the officers? I know I said both. For the agency, for the officers, and for the community, right? So that's what I have. That's what I want to talk about today, is just taking a look at what there is, in a sense, in the past, and now trying to drive forward to make that change for the future, to help our agencies along, to help our community along, to be more cohesive and to grow about a better practice for all of the agencies across the world, right? I mean, there's always going to be a better way to do it, but what works best for your agency, again, might not work best for another. And so just got to reach out, figure out what might be there, take in more podcasts, read some research, find what you need to, go to the conferences as they start opening back up, virtual or not, and just keep consuming the information, so that way you can help your agency grow, you can help the community be safer, you can help your officers be safer, and everything run a little bit more smoothly and have a purpose right behind it as well, as opposed to just popping out numbers. Anybody can pretty much do that, right? So that's what I have for you folks today. Thank you for joining me today, and feel free to pop on over to NIRO Crime Analysis. That's NIROCA.com. Do have a membership over there that you can sign up for. I have opened up my Slack channel. I don't know, I think I've probably got 2 weeks left on the Slack invite, and then I'll roll it through again. But I'm going to have that open, continue to be open for academia, for people of research, pracademics, everybody that's called one or the other, researchers, analysts, students of analysts, professors, anybody who wants to sign in and join up, really believing that this network that we can start forging at this point is going to help all of us continue to grow and make a better space for the law enforcement and policing communities across the globe. Because I really think that research, that practical piece, and us as analysts and researchers helping each other continue to not only support but grow, again, those practices, those better practices, evidence-based, are going to be a major foundation for this growth in the policing world. So thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Sign up for the NIRO CA, the NIRO Crime Analysis / NIRO Knowledge newsletter, get some information from there, and join the Slack community and pop in, say hi, and learn about a lot of the great people across the globe that have already started joining in. And I will chat with you all again next week. Thank you.